Good morning, good afternoon. For those of you who are joining us where today's guest is from, I am thrilled to have join me today on the Payments Geek Roundtable the intrepid, the infamous, the more than famous Dave Birch from Consult Hyperion. Dave, thank you so much for joining us on the Payments Geek Roundtable today. I'm looking forward to a wide-ranging, wide-read conversation about what's going on in payments and some of the things that you've been writing about and talking about recently. If you don't mind, say hi and tell people a little bit about your background, where you come from, and all that kind of good stuff.
Sure. Well, it all began a great many years ago at a small hospital, St George's Hospital in Tooting in southwest London. And no, that's probably a little too much detail for this.
No. I was going to settle in. It sounded good.
The relevant thing, I'm global ambassador for Consult Hyperion, which is a specialist electronic transactions consultancy, which I helped to found a great many years ago. And I've written some books, and I have a number of advisory positions here and there. So I focus very much on digital money and digital identity and kind of the future where payments is going.
Well, good, because that's exactly what we want to talk about today on the Payments Geek Roundtable. I'm Bruce Parker, your erstwhile host, I suppose, and moderator and whatever else it is. I'll be asking Dave some questions. You guys can ask questions too if you want to push the Q&A button. I won't promise that I'm going to get to all of them, but I will definitely at least try to figure out how to click on everything and do all that good stuff. Well, so Dave, you recently had an article posted in Forbes that was really, really interesting, describing, or I guess the title was, "Buy Fintech, Hello Techfin." I want to parse a few things in there, but actually we're going to violate one of our long-standing rules on the Payments Geek Roundtable, and it's because you're here. It's because you're a special guest, and we hold you in such high esteem. We normally have a rule that we never talk about coronavirus on the Payments Geek Roundtable, just because it's done, it's overdone. But actually, one of the first things you called out in your article was some of the impacts you think that coronavirus has had, and on the industry of payments certainly, but also more broadly. And in particular, I think as we start to frame up the future and thinking about the future and talking about the future, how do you think people's perspective on change and the future and status quo maybe have shifted, even in just the last 6 to 9 months, due to what the globe is grappling with?
I mean, I think we have to distinguish between the sort of payment stuff and, if you like, the payments related stuff. So on the payment side, I think you can reasonably say that the virus simply accelerated trends that were already there. We were already going cashless. We were already going contactless. We were already going contact free, actually, even more than contactless. So on the one hand, you can say it accelerated those things. I'm talking about other countries, of course. In America, they were still posting stimulus checks to people like sort of Little House on the Prairie, but we'll broaden the discussion to other areas. Yeah. So on the one hand, the crisis accelerated trends that I think we all saw in place. One thing I have noticed is the transition to contact-free rather than contactless has accelerated quite rapidly. And just to give an example, I had lunch at a garden centre near where we live a few days ago, and even there, you went in and you scanned a QR code and it came up on the phone, and then you go and sit at the table, you punch in the table number, you order what you want, the waitress brings it around, and then when you've finished, you just hit OK and walk out. Now, people who would never have done that before, and actually some people who might never even pay with contactless cards, now are used to doing this on their phone and sitting down. It was the same actually in the British Airways lounge when I flew out of London yesterday. In the lounge, they put QR codes on the tables. You sit, instead of going to the buffet, you sit down at the table, scan the code, order your food. The guy brings it over, the coffee and stuff like that. Now, having experienced that, it's not transparently obvious to me that people will go back to doing it the old way.
Sure.
Because actually, it's kind of easy and convenient and it works. And it has one, we characterize, I think I remember talking to you about this at a dinner a little while back. we characterize this as the shift from check out to check in. So the idea that you check into places rather than checking out of them. And of course, what that means is when you scan the code, or when you use location services or whatever it is to announce that you're in a place, the service providers, whether it's food, drink, anything else, can deliver a much better service to you because now they know who you are. I mean, not literally who you are, it can be done pseudonymously, but the point is when you walk in, they know that you're the guy that bought the toothpaste last week and whatever. So this transition to contact free rather than contactless. I mean, you see, even in pubs here now, you go to the pub and you order on the phone and you sit at the table. And actually, that's another interesting example, because just to digress for a second on that. So in one of the big pubs chains in the UK, basically they've been using this app for a long time, but the virus has accelerated it. So now, you order your drinks on the app and they bring them over to you. But of course, you can also order drinks for anybody else in any other one of these pubs in the entire country, because you just need to know the pub number. And so you've got into where, I mean, I don't want to tell the whole kind of sordid story that I read about it, but the point is, you've already seen like interesting new behavior that I wouldn't have thought about before. Sure. The fact you can, like you're in the bar in Austin and I can buy you a drink even though I'm not there. It's
and I'm not either. I live in Dallas, but that's a good point.
Right. That's a good point. So there are some things like that where it's. I mean, you need to talk to like UX and customer experience experts and stuff, but from a payments point of view, it's not obvious people will go back to the old way. And I think we've known for a while, actually, in the particular case of food service, when you go over to apps, the particular value to the average customer is actually the bill at the end. The fact that you can do, you finish your dinner and you just click it, put on the tap whether you want to do 10% or 15% or whatever, and then you just get up and walk out. Mm-hmm. Actually, that's a pretty good experience. People like that. So you've got those kind of payment things, and I don't think any of us would disagree about the trends there. But then you've got some adjacencies, the kind of stuff that's kind of related to payments that the virus has kind of thrown into pretty sharp relief. And so the examples there are things like fraud and security. So now you have zillions of people going online who were never online before. You've got a real example known to me personally. You've got someone who runs a little store and actually people want to continue buying stuff from the little local store. So now they have to get a card reader that they never had before, and they don't want a stupid POS or sign up with an ISO. So they get a Square or an iZettle or whatever. And then they discover that the iZettle thing, which is now PayPal, of course, it has some stock management stuff on it, which is really great. And they didn't know it was there, and now they can use that and so on. But that means also there's millions of people going online who've never been online before, who don't understand the rules, who are very susceptible to fraudsters and miscreants of one form or another. So I haven't seen any figures yet, but I fully expect to see a really significant rise in fraud figures as we move through the year. So that's one down. So we need to do something about the kind of security stuff. There's the whole stuff around identity, both the identity of people and the identity of businesses. So the UK, I think, very similar to the US in that the lack of that sort of infrastructure, most of the time we kind of muddle through, right? So we don't have ID cards. You don't have ID cards. You think ID cards are something to do with Russia and North Korea. We think ID cards are something to do with France. Neither of us want them. We regard them as totems of tyranny. And then when the roof falls in, all of a sudden you go, God damn it, I need to be able to, to get government stimulus and support, for example, the identity of businesses has turned out to be a huge headache. The linking of businesses to people. How do you know I'm an executive officer of this business? How do you know that business is a real business? And the kinds of frauds that are going on there are spectacular. So that's so I think it's pushed home a few points about identity that we've certainly spoken about in the past, that maybe it's time to kind of take this a bit more seriously and do something about it.
Yeah, good enough is no longer.
Good enough is no longer. And in the US case, but in a different trajectory in the US, I also think it's going to spill out a bit into the kind of open banking stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the thing is, having direct access to accounts so that you can so for example, if you want to assess whether my business, is my business a real business, one easy way, I mean, you can write letters to my accountant and whatever, you can go and talk to the auditors. My auditors are the same as Wirecards, so you can take them. No, I shouldn't joke. But what you could do is just go look at my bank account. So if I've given you permission, through the API, you want to go, you can look at my bank account. You can instantly, as it turns out, because some other things were involved in, I think the situation in the US is the same. It turns out that you don't need that much of that transactional data in order to make some sensible calculations about liquidity. There's some low-hanging fruit there in the SME space, which in the UK has been attacked quite vigorously. And you've got some great companies in that space, Coconut and guys like that, who, small businesses are good because they're very poor users of credit services. They tend to fund themselves in very inefficient ways using credit card balances and overdrafts. So if I can get access to your small business's bank account, I can very quickly, and with not that sophisticated AI, machine learning, whatever, look at a few months transactions and say, well, okay, first of all, it's a real business and that, we can support them, whatever. But I can also say, you know what, this guy's a bit of an idiot because he keeps running that credit card balance. And actually I can get him a good loan, at a good rate from this bank who now knows that he's a real person or whatever. And it's kind of a bit a win-win. Right, in that sort of thing.
Yeah, so, actually, you're sounding a lot like our friend Nick Thomas from Finicity on that. He's been on that recently. As
I say, it has a slightly different trajectory in the US because in the UK and in Europe, the open banking stuff is mandated. It's a regulatory, and in the US, it's bubbling up in different ways. But yes, I think we're beginning to observe some of the same things there. What I would say in the European case is you begin to see early discussions about what you might label open finance rather than just open banking. So in other words, one of the things that's come out of this is if I'm really trying to help you and your family in a time of great crisis and stress, and I want to provide direct subsidy to you, then just seeing your bank account isn't enough. I need to see your cards and your mortgages and your pensions and insurance. So in other words, and this, people label this, and actually I label it too because it's a convenient label, but this is about delivering financial health rather than delivering financial services. Mm-hmm. And you just see, like if you're looking at the corner of your eye, I think you can detect the first baby steps into that transition as well. So broadly speaking, I think you see the virus has an impact on the payment space, things we would broadly agree on. And then the virus has an impact on some adjacencies where there's a little more speculation, but I feel quite comfortable in making one or two of those predictions.
Wow. All right. Well, the audience will take note. We'll check back in the next 5 or 6 years and see how you did. So
absolutely.
Actually, if I just take a step back to like the title of that article,
sure.
It was Buy Fintech, Hello Techfin. So seeing that I'm only going to be able to grab the microphone back from you every once in a while here, let me give you a couple of thoughts here to maybe frame up. Could you define those terms? Fintech maybe is your perspective on. Techfin kind of sounds like that's a new thing, and either you made it up or somebody else did.
Right.
And then, you quoted our mutual friend and debate sparring partner Ron Shevlin as, "Hey, look, this transition that you're calling out is sort of the end of an era, the end of an experimentation stage for the entire industry on a more global perspective." I wonder if you characterize that, and do you mean by that you're expecting less innovation as we go forward? So if you wouldn't mind, just kind of roll through a couple of those ideas, just literally from the title of that Forbes article.
Sure. Okay. Well, just to say what I mean by those terms, then, just to distinguish them. So when I say that, what I mean is a fintech is a company that's business model is financial services that it delivers using new technology. So like a Monzo or something. It's a fintech. It's like the services they're offering you are actually in many ways not in the least bit innovative, exciting, new, or radical. They're offering you a debit card which has been around for like 40 years or something, but they're using new technology to do it in a better way, and hopefully very much now. And fintechs, pretty soon, I am not an expert on the history of banking by any means, but I mean, there's an issue about the cost of capital, and eventually you end up having to either be a bank or being bought by a bank, or because you just cannot get the money to fund those financial services in any other way. So fintechs try to make money from financial services, whether it's loans or credit cards or whatever else, but they use new technology to do it. Conversely, the Techfins, and the example I think I used in that, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was Amazon was the example I was using. What I would categorize as the Techfins are the people that have a business model that makes money from something else. They don't care about making money from financial services. So they provide financial services because it's a better service for their customer. Mm-hmm. But they don't care if the margin on those financial services is zero. In fact, in many cases, they don't care if the margin on those financial services is negative, because their business model isn't the financial services. So, marketplaces that do, merchant funding, maybe they make some money on that, but actually if they don't make any money, it doesn't matter, because their business model is contingent on having the merchants there and making transactions and so on. So that's why I distinguish between the fintechs and the Techfins. And I agree with what Ron said about we are in a way coming to the end of an era of that sort of fintech experimentation, and we're moving into the time of the Techfins. The point you make about innovation, I think, is in a way more. There was one of the studies I quoted was a large scale study across a number of different industries, looking at innovation. In other words, what inventions were turned into sustainable new business models over time. And I think, if I remember correctly, the business you would expect to see at the top of that was pharmaceuticals. So in the pharmacy, you constantly have to invent new drugs. You constantly have to come up with new business models around them, depending on what the drugs are and what they do. And you have sustained innovation. Otherwise, you go out of business. So you would expect to see pharmaceuticals at the top. Sure enough, they were there. Not only did banking come way down that list, I was stunned to see that it came below textile. The textile industry was rated on a global basis as more innovative than the banking in textiles. The last new textile.
We have a small but very vigorous segment of the audience that are in the textile industry. So I just go easily, sir.
I'm just saying the last new textile I can think of is cotton, or maybe nylon.
Fun fact: Berkshire Hathaway was a textile mill. Anyways.
Yeah, that's right. It was. Yeah. So I thought that was kind of and I thought, well, this can't. And then when I began to think about it, I was thinking, well, what is this fintech innovation that we've seen? Because if I think about my phone right now, I mean, the financial application I use the most is my Barclays Bank application. Sure. And I'm sure, Monzo and N26 and whatever contributed to pressure that made my Barclays banking application, much better. It works fine, But what do I do with that banking application? I access a checking account, a debit card, a credit card, a mortgage account, a savings account that are exactly the same as they were before that phone was even invented. I mean, before the iPhone was even thought of.
Right. May even be run on the same mainframe. Maybe the
very well, because it's a if you start tinkering with the COBOL, Bruce, it's a big risk, and it's a risk that none of us would want to take.
I often do that on weekends, actually.
So if you're going to be harsh, you would have to say that actually there's not been anything like the innovation that's necessary to propel the industry forward. And I was challenged about this. So that I was talking about this to somebody the other day, and they said, "Oh, well, if you're so clever, what kind of innovations?" And I said, like, I can think of lots of things that I've seen. I don't know how you turn these into businesses because I'm not an entrepreneur, but I'll give you one example,
Sure.
which is given demographics, given the the fact that America is stumbling into a senile gerontocracy with historically unprecedented levels of income inequality. You would expect to see.
We're not getting into politics today. I'm just thrilled.
No, I'm not. No, it's not a political point. I'm just making a general demographic.
No, it's a demographic comment. I got it.
It's not a political point that the average age of voters in your election is going to be 56.
That's right.
And that none of the two candidates are both. I didn't even know how old they. What are they? 109 or something? I don't even know.
109 and 137. Yep.
Exactly. So how come we haven't seen the kind of intergenerational product you'd expect to see yet? My dad is 93. He shouldn't be authenticating transactions about anything. If he makes a transaction, I should be authenticating it. Mm-hmm. How can I use my meager savings, my provisions against the future of destitution? How can I use those to support my kids in trying to buy a house, which is broadly speaking impossible for them in current circumstances? How do we have savings products that reflect, these different phases in life and try to bring them together? So, demographics is a good example of where we haven't seen anything in this space.
Well, and it's interesting, the wealth transfer in the U.S., and I think this is broadly the case in a number of developed economies. Japan certainly has this issue too, and they're kind of a couple steps ahead versus the U.S., but I think a number of others as well. I know I was reading something about Italy's demographics and economics as well. Your point is very well taken. There could be a brand new way of thinking about, okay, I'll take on the elderly role for the purposes of this argument. I'm elderly. I do have children who are becoming adult children. How could my assets be used to sort of underwrite or facilitate something like a mortgage, which of course I'd be very keen to help them get on the path to home ownership in a different way than the current state. And in the current state, everything's kind of a mass product, and that would be an interesting form of customized product that reflects a very different way of thinking about it. And I think you're absolutely right that at present, most of the things we've seen from banks are kind of reactive to the fintechs. But I guess, to me, this is an interesting point, and I think we're clear. Thad Peterson just let us know, maybe I wasn't supposed to call him out, but he is writing down that phrase about the senile gerontocracy for future use.
Hey, listen,
he's worried about forgetting it in future. So I think that may be a comment also.
I've written down a fair few of his phrases over the years. So there's that.
Dear Thad, yes. Hello, Thad. Okay, so let's set all that aside for just a second. Let's go back to forward looking. Got it. We're in a little bit of a pickle here. It's a technical term. So why don't you tell me a little bit about this notion of embedded financial services? You touched on it a moment ago of sort of, it flips the script, which is why we reverse the order of the tech and the fin to talk about these Techfins. What is the nature of embedded financial services? And is there foundationally, does that mean the torch for innovation now is passed from the fintech to these other organizations, or is there collaboration with the banks? Or paint us a picture of what the embedded financial services means, because I think on the next level down, that'll get really interesting. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about the role of the various participants in the ecosystem.
Well, look, first of all, there are different kinds of financial services, which
payments are the best, by the way.
Payments are in a way. So when I'm doing this in a kind of scenario planning setting with clients, there was an old. Well, I think of it as old, but there was a breakdown many years ago in Harvard Business Review that I find very useful. I use all the time, where they have these you have these three core functions and these three adjacent functions of financial services. So you have the core functions, or you have transfers in space, payments, transfers in time, savings and loan, transfers in scale, which is investment banking, and so on. And then you have these three, you have incentive functions that bring transactions into the financial system, you have risk functions, and you have information functions. And the way to assess the impact of new technologies on financial services is not to think of financial services as an amorphous mass, but to look at the impact on those functions and see how, I mean, there are other ways of doing it. It's not a law of physics, but this is the way that I've found quite useful to think about it. Now, the crucial role of payments in that space is that payments represent almost all of the touch points. So I can't remember the figure for American banks, but 85, 90% of the touch points. If you lose access to those touch points, then you lose access to the data, which means your information functions are suboptimal. If your information functions are suboptimal, you can't enhance your risk functions. If you can't manage risk, then what the hell are you doing in the banking business? You might as well go do something else instead and let somebody else take over. So that's the kind of how that circle works. So what we want is, from a banking point of view, we want the embedding to take place because we want financial services to be easy and efficient and cheap and good for people. And frankly, I've no evidence that we're the best people to run the customer interface and user experience and whatever else anyway. So just to use an example that came from a discussion earlier on, I'm in Facebook. I see an advert for some pants that I want. Right now, I click on the advert for the pants and I choose the pants and I get the right color and whatever. And then I click pay, and then I have to go off to some web page somewhere and start trying to remember my credit card numbers and all this kind of thing. It doesn't seem right. Now, you could imagine a future where I see the advert in Facebook and there's some pants I want and I just hit pay and it just happens, right? And, via the magic of APIs and consent management and strong authentication and passive biometrics and everything else, the money just gets whizzed from my bank account to the pants company's bank account. And maybe Facebook makes nothing on that transaction. But because that transaction can take place, I'm in Facebook. And I'm not coming out of Facebook to go and do other things in other places because I can do it in Facebook. I'm in Facebook and I say, oh, yeah, okay, we're going to go to this show tonight. I got the tickets. Bruce, you owe me $15 for the ticket. And then in your messenger, you just type plus $15 and the $15 shows up in my account, goes from yours. Payments, that's easy to imagine, that kind of embedding. And actually, I think that's actually a pretty good proposition because, it's not obvious to me that my bank app is a better way of doing it or whatever. But when you start talking about those other functions, particularly the sort of kind of information functions, risk management functions, then things become a little more competitive because you don't want to get into the situation. I mean, the case study everybody uses is China, and that's because we've got the figures from China. So I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I think the Chinese banks lost whatever it was, I don't know, $1 trillion in fees last year because all the payments went through WeChat and Alipay instead of going through the banks. But actually, if you look at...
I think that's an extraordinary data point for the end of the fintech era. I appreciate you bringing that up.
Actually, I hadn't thought about it in that way, but yes, I think you're probably right. It's a
contraexample.
No, but it's not because those companies, those super apps are not just about payments. They're about you keeping you in the Alipay, like the payments. Yes, they make some money out of it. It's a lot less now, actually, by the way, because the Chinese government changed the rules about what you could do with the floats and all this sort of thing. But it keeps you in Alipay. It keeps you in the ecosystem to do it. But the point is the Chinese banks, and it's an odd thing, but I've over the last few years I've run a number of courses for Chinese banks on it sounds funny kind of talking to Chinese banks about technology. They should be teaching us about it, but the thing is, those fees, that was factored in. So the banks already had strategic models which had the payment revenues asymptotic to zero, right? You already knew, and they can recover from that because they have other services and blah blah blah. But what turned out to be problematic was the lack of data. So when you don't see those payment transactions, you have no idea what the customers are doing. I mean, all you see is WeChat, Alipay. You have no idea whether the customers are, in the city or in the country, if they were buying travel or insurance, whatever. Were they spending this money on home improvements or insurance? You don't see any of that data. And Alipay and WeChat see all of it. And, as history has demonstrated, even the most cursory examination of the 700-page IPO filing for Alipay, which we were all excitedly combing through last week, not reading any of the text, we were just looking at the charts and tables in it. I'm sure Thad was doing the same. The most cursory examination of that shows you an incredible spectrum of financial services that are being provided on the back of that data. So when we see the embedding, if I'm a bank, I want to provide the best possible API, the best possible service, the most efficient authentication, because I want Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple, I want them to use me because I want to see that data, And if I can't see any of that data, I have a real problem. So I'm not the only person that thinks embedding is where we're all going. But what I probably would say is that I think if I'm trying to develop a strategy towards embedding from the bank side, it's quite difficult because you don't want to end up in a situation of using that Facebook example, right? When I pull up Facebook on my phone to look at that pants advert, Facebook has, in whatever it is, I can't even remember, it's 80 milliseconds or something. Facebook has said, okay, so here's dreary middle-aged man, bored, bit of money to spend, has bought pants in the past, by the way. Who wants this ad? Right. And it goes out to auction, and somebody bids for that, and in 80 milliseconds that shows up on my screen. Well, if I'm a bank, it's kind of a depressing view of the future to be on the other end of that auction, which is, okay, I've got this guy, he's just bought this TV, we're going to finance it over, Klarna style kind of thing. So, he's going to pay over, 6 interest-free installments over the next 6 months. It's $1,900. Who wants it? And if the only role of the bank is to try and win those auctions to stay in the transaction space, that might be the most efficient way of running the economy. But as we were talking earlier on, if you're the guy that runs payments in a bank, that may not be the most exciting future for you career-wise.
Absolutely. Well, let's start talking about some of that. Payments have really had a big run of attention, right? People have been talking about payments more at this stage of the career, or my career, than they were before. And that coolness kind of surprises me. It sort of surprises me. I'm in an industry that's cool for these reasons. My children assure me I am not, in fact, cool. So do you think that level of attention or coolification or focus is going to continue broadly in the economy?
First of all, I'm like you in the sense. I can remember when payments was boring, and then it was exciting and fun, which I much preferred. It was exciting, but we're probably coming to the end of that. Look, I think in many organizations, there have been reasons for getting involved with payments, okay? So if you take the canonical examples that people often talk about, I won't use Facebook as an example, think of a different, Uber would be a good example, right? So why did Uber spend so much effort on creating wallets and payments and whatever? Well, it's because the financial system didn't deliver those products.
Right.
It's the same example. I remember all those years ago working for Transport for London, which is, one of the projects that I remember most fondly. So why did a transport company spend gazillions making contactless cards and giving them to people? Well, because the banks didn't. The banks didn't provide suitable products for that. So people had to step in and do it. When the banks came along and provided a product that did do it, contactless cards, then the transit companies were happy to use those instead, And I sort of see it in a similar kind of way. So along comes the internet. We have some amazing new requirements for payments, particularly bidirectionality. You've got to pay out, all over the world in different currencies. And if you think about like the management at Airbnb, managing these multi-currency, and basically the banks just didn't have the products to do that. So people had to build them themselves. But I sort of feel we're coming to the end of that era. I think because in reality, in a great many countries, the instant credit networks, as they swing into operation, you have open banking sitting on top of them. You have a kind of different set of issues to worry about, which are to do with digital identity, consent management, authentication. But the idea, broadly speaking, that, I fire up my Telegram or WhatsApp and I send $5 to Bruce, and under the hood, that no longer wanders through ISO 8583 card networks with Band-Aids stuck on them, but instead gets zipped into 222 super speed FedNow, and a few microseconds later shows up in your account with, rich data and enhanced service and all that sort of thing. Unless I'm really missing something, I can't help but feel that a lot of things are going to move in that direction. It's very interesting to me in the UK recently. So in the UK, there's a project running called RTP, Request to Pay.
Sure.
And the idea here is, you have a standardized 222 request to pay document. The biller or the merchant, whoever sends that out, the RTP document gets received at your, as the customer. It goes into whatever it's been directed to in my phone, my bank app or something. A thing pops up, says, Bruce wants $5. Is it okay to pay him? I put my thumb on it or whatever. I hit okay. And a transfer is initiated in return. I can't help but feel that is the generalized platform for most things. It's much cheaper to operate all payments in credit networks. It's much cheaper not to have debit pulls, because then you never have failures and
right, push versus pull. Absolutely.
So it is. I wouldn't say it's depressing, because there's a lot of exciting work to be done in building those networks in the API space. But yeah, I'd agree with your general sentiment. I think the Precambrian explosion of payments is over.
Okay, so that you actually touched on a couple of companies, Airbnb and Uber. I think Netflix has this, as do a number of others. Unicorns that kind of built a payco or a payments company. They've kind of highlighted that. I think you were calling that out as sort of a failure of the industry to provide those services, so they did it themselves. But I think what that in particular highlighted is the strategic role of payments in very large organizations, very large enterprises. How about that piece of like, okay, payments is a P&L, payments is something strategic, payments is something where it's thought of in the sort of upper ranks of the organization's decision makers and thinkers?
Well, I have two. First of all, I have quite a strong reaction to the use of the word unicorn, because I wouldn't call them unicorns. I would call them probably Yangtze River dolphins, on the grounds that they're rare but actually exist, whereas unicorns, just to remind you, don't exist.
So sure? Can you prove a negative, sir?
Use of the word.
Can you prove a negative?
The use of the word unicorn just really bothers me in that context. So
I've never heard that. That's a perfect little side trip, and I realize we're losing half of our audience at the moment, but the Yangtze River dolphins is a perfect.
They're rare,
They're very rare.
So that to one side. Payments as a P&L. This is why I'm with Ron about the transition to Techfin, because the payments contribution to the business isn't going to be the fin stuff. It's not going to be margin and whatever. It's going to be keeping people there, delivering data, making other services more appealing and more attractive. So that's not a P&L in that same way, is it? I don't think, Bruce. I mean, I mean, you're closer to a wider. I mean, I really know the financial sector side of this. You're closer to customers in a much wider range of businesses. So I'd actually be curious as to your feeling about that.
Me. That's perfect. Yeah, so we talked to a lot of Global 2000s. We talked to a lot of pretty big companies that you've heard of. I won't just start dishing names right now, although I'd love to. But what we see a lot of is people kind of looking across. Let's imagine you're a large entertainment conglomerate and you're staring over there at Netflix, and one of the things you realized is, well, wait a second, those folks have been investing in their payment stack for decades. They've minted some of the best and the brightest in the entire industry. As people have gone through, as called the CEO of the Payco. I'll try that on you again in just a second with a different name. But I think what's interesting to me is everybody kind of prosecutes a little bit the last war, right? They think in terms of, okay, what were the terms and conditions under which, for instance, Netflix showed up, or Airbnb showed up if you're in hospitality, or Uber showed up if you're in transportation more broadly.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, that's a fair point.
So if that's the case, then we talked to a bunch of folks that kind of see an elevator ride or an escalator ride, whichever, or maybe now that we're not in offices, it's sort of some sort of Zoom escalation or elevation that enables them to change the trajectory of their careers by kind of calling out payments, maybe in a similar way to more recently people called out business intelligence, data analytics, tried to become a chief data officer. Prior to that, you have CRM, and so then there was sort of, I need to think in terms of customers and customer contact, customer relationship, customer success, client success, definitions around that. Maybe even keep going back. There was something around procurement, supply chain, and working capital management, whatever. Those all ended up on platforms. Like as I'm saying those, you're probably thinking in terms of Palantir and Salesforce and various supply chain folks back in the mists of time. The earlier parts of my career.
Salesforce is a great example of that because the ecosystem that it generated on top of it is astonishing.
It's amazing. It's amazing for a contact manager, right?
Yeah.
Which obviously it's wildly outgrown. So on that, so you react really strongly to payments to unicorns, which is perfect. I'd love a reaction on what banks have always called. You talked about financial services, payment czars. So those of us with long tenures in payments and banking know that things didn't work out for payment czars any better than they worked out for kind of Russian czars. So I would love your favorite Russian history or literature quote or bon mot on czars and referencing payment czars. And then specifically, if you're a payment czar, if you're the CEO of a Payco, kind of what are the things that probably you should be thinking about? Like if you want to take that elevator ride up and you see this thing happening, like, okay, the person who championed Salesforce is now towering over this large enterprise from an organizational perspective in their silo. I want to do the same thing because I've been doing payment stuff and I know it's cool. It may not be as cool going forward, but I'm still committed to the cause. How do you think about that organizationally?
Well, to the first point, I always give the same because I love the quote and I use it all the time on Twitter, and I think I've encouraged quite a few other people to use it, which is Lenin. I don't know if you're allowed to quote Lenin on American podcasts or if there's. Oh, okay.
It's the accent. The accent is permission.
There's probably some act of 1951, which means it's sedition. Lenin said once that there are decades where nothing happens. And then there are weeks when years happen. In other words, this is this theory of punctuated equilibrium, which is basically suddenly things kind of tumble out of control, right, which is probably where we are now with the sort of COVID thing.
Feels that way someday.
But the point is it's chaotic. You can't always see where things are going to land. So yes, it didn't end well for the actual czar, but it's not ended well for payment czars either. So yes, I mean, we are in a kind of chaotic time. But if you were an up and coming executive, scanning the horizon in financial services, I think like a lot of other people, I'm not the only person that thinks this by any means. I would be looking at how the API ecosystem is going to evolve and develop, because I think we can all see this kind of world of open data, open finance, what people call the Amazonization of the industry, because the idea that everything you produce is a service and everything you consume is another service. I'm too old to understand how the actual mechanics of any of these things work properly, but you can see when you go from that kind of simple, let's open up an API, any of you that have lived through this process know that it's just really not that simple, right? You just publish the API and connect to it. Well, no, you don't, because you've got to have identification, authentication, authorization. You've got to have consent management. You've got to manage the upgrade cycles. You've got to work out how to keep, things, when you move from one to another, you've got to make sure they all work together. You've got to keep track of sort of standardization and blah, blah, blah. So I think actually maybe thinking the way that you're thinking, if you were your young self now, I don't doubt you'd be looking around at a sort of API geek opportunity in that space, because it's probably the same. In 20 years, APIs that's just how things work. It'll just be like electricity, but right now, there's a lot of pressure to move in that direction. And as I say, people that have lived through it, it's just not that simple.
Well, I think you're raising a really, really good point. I will demonstrate that I know not nearly as much Russian history or literature by butchering a Tolstoy quote, which I like to do, which is that all happy payments are happy in the same way, and all unhappy payments are unhappy in very different ways, which actually reminds me of yet another quote from another famous author, yourself, which are payments are a pain in the ass. I was reading to make sure I got a quote correctly. So yeah, I think that's the issue, right? Like there's a lot of complications here. And so like if we're going to put a couple more like marks on the board, what do you think that impacts that complexity that, hey, yeah, there's APIs. Hey, yeah, it's going to become this expectation. Maybe it's a little less cool. Maybe it's a little bit more de rigueur. Like this is keeping up with the Joneses. This is keeping up with the everyone's from an organizational perspective, from a go-to-market perspective. I know for sure we've had a bunch of conversations that say, hey, look, Netflix's payments experience and our payments experience from a leading vendor who's been around a long time, you can tell just by looking at them. They're not the same. And that's a huge problem. So what do you think the implications are in terms of, okay, you and I have spent decades thinking about strategies and infrastructure, relationships that are important in that. You're thinking of a few names. I'm thinking of a few names. So like it was the case that you could bet on a few really, really big guys and generally you'd be fine. I'm not so sure that that's the case anymore. Like, so what's the right way to approach that? There's complexity. There's this expectation that's changed. The bar's been raised. And before we get to the point where APIs and payments more broadly are like the delivery of electricity or delivery, maybe I'll say it slightly differently, of something like a web experience or a mobile app experience, all big discontinuities that have occurred and they're now just established, expected, and even banks are expected to have halfway decent looking websites and apps, which they never were a while ago. What are the key points to be thinking about? And I'll just put in a little plug. What do you think the notion of that platform that supports that, and particularly the notion of orchestration versus delivery yourself or outsourcing has an impact?
No, I think orchestration is a word that comes up a lot nowadays because a lot of people. So the fact that you can orchestrate, actually APIs and so on make that a lot easier in the sense that you can plug and play the different things. So you don't have to rip out whole infrastructures anymore. You can orchestrate across the links. And the idea that you orchestrate so that you take best of breed in different areas, but present them through a common interface, I think is actually quite a strong proposition. And I think the reason why people like the orchestration part of it is because they don't necessarily want to throw all of their eggs in any one particular basket. Right. I saw a comment, I can't remember yesterday, today, it's all a bit blurry to me, but I saw a comment, was it from, I can't remember who it's from now. Somebody said, there's whatever it is, there's 5,000 banks in the US, but they all run on about 4 different systems,
15,000.
Yeah. And that's not the future. The future isn't that you go and buy your banking infrastructure from this provider, and you look at what people like Thought Machine are doing, and it does kind of throw up a different. So you orchestrate because of the ability that you're given through APIs and stuff like that, and then maybe you take some stuff from here, some stuff from there, and actually it's constantly shifting as people come in with more innovative, better solutions, different margins, that kind of thing. And so the need for an orchestrator, which is that's different from having a czar, isn't it? Because when you and I talk about an orchestrator, you're talking about a software platform.
I am. Yes.
Yeah, and I agree with that, because as this person who's managing that, I want it orchestrated. I don't want to have to keep making these micro calculations continuously about which of these platforms or services I should be using. So I think that's a pretty reasonable vision of the future, and I would say marketplace activity would tend to support that view. It's not dominant, but if you look at where fun stuff is going on, which I think was what the question was, it's kind of more in that direction, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think it's the stuff to work towards, because we're all looking to achieve a shared vision of the future, which obviously is probably based in a hopeful, more optimistic, we're going to solve problems together kind of esprit de corps, right? Payments are interesting to me precisely because you cannot perform, like there's absolutely no way to participate in payments without a concept of collaboration. Like there are so many parties involved in payments. Even when you're talking about a cash transaction, okay, we both happen to believe this piece of paper has value due to some guarantor and some other set of facts and circumstances. It's always connected and complicated, which I think is interesting. Well, we're nearly out of time, and I do want to wrap up. And I was thinking about this. I had a couple of different ways I was thinking of asking kind of a final question. And I thought, well, I'm spinning around on you a little bit. You and I have had very bold, robust conversations over many, many years, generally enjoyable, oftentimes with a bit of food and or beverage. So I'm wondering, you do a zillion of these things. I mean, you do these things all the time. And this is probably your 800 and gazillion of a webinar or conversation like this. What question has no one ever asked you that you really wish they would? Is there something like, wait a second, why didn't we talk about, not necessarily what should have I asked you, but how do you want to close this out? What topic did we touch on?
What a strange question to finish on. Well, the question I suppose that I've never been asked about any of these things is quite why I'm so fascinated.
There you are.
Quite why I'm so fascinated, and I'm not even sure I know the answer to it. But the transition in money fascinates me. So when we had the Industrial Revolution, we created a new kind of economy. We didn't have the money for that economy, and it took quite a while to create the new kind of money. You had the settlement between the monarch and the city to give you central banking, and you had fiat currency, and then you had checks and whatever. But it took quite a long time to go from the no money economy of the essentially agricultural economy, and then you needed a new economy to feed the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly you needed money where you didn't have money before, but actually in a very short time, in a space of about 30 or 40 years, you suddenly had central banks, checks, circulating banknotes, the proto-gold standard. That actually happened, looking back on it now, in quite a short period. So I think why I'm so obsessed with this is that we're now in a similar kind of time. We're going through a post-industrial revolution, and we don't yet have the money of that post-industrial revolution. And don't say Bitcoin, because that's that's a first approximation of anything. So I guess the reason why I'm so obsessed with this is because I just haven't yet seen what the answer is. I see all these, and I track very closely what's going on, and I'm excited by them. But in reality, I just haven't seen what's coming next. I haven't seen the Isaac Newton. I haven't seen the Bank of England.
Right.
I haven't seen the gold standard. I haven't seen the goldsmith's check. I haven't seen these things yet, and I'm getting older. So,
but I think to return to your Lenin quote and close out, we need to close with Lenin, right?
Okay, all right.
Maybe I was trying to think of a John Lennon quote too, but in any case, yeah, we're in a period of time.
Give payments a chance. That was him, wasn't it?
I love it. Yes, now you're butchering quotes. It's perfect. It's perfect. I love that. Give payments a chance. And it does appear that we're going to see a tremendous amount of change in a very, very short period of time. It's an extraordinary period in the history of the world, in the history of the globe, and as well the history of our industry. Dave, thank you so much for joining us on the Payments Geek.
It's always interesting talking to you, Bruce. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. I look forward to another opportunity to break bread and toast a glass of something or other yummy. And I hope you stay well. Stay well over there on your side of the pond.
Catch up soon.
Thanks, Dave. Take care.
Bye, guys.